All right, let's dive into this. America's journey from the Roaring '20s all the way through the Great Depression and into the New Deal era.
Oh, yeah.
You guys have given us a ton of fascinating sources.
Yeah,
Really interesting stuff to unpack here.
absolutely.
So we're going to pull out some of the most insightful bits, give you a sense of what this period was all about. And it was a wild ride. Dizzying highs and crushing lows, shaped the nation we know today.
Right.
We're talking about flappers pushing those social boundaries, farmers facing just unimaginable hardships,
Right.
and the birth of that quote-unquote American standard of living ideal,
Yes.
which we'll see was a little more complicated than it sounded.
Yeah, it definitely had some layers to it, for sure. What's really fascinating to me is how this era, even with all of the drama, all the ups and downs,
Oh, yeah.
it really laid the groundwork for so much of what we just consider normal in American society.
Wait, like,
Everything from consumer culture to how we think about social safety nets.
I mean, let's just start with the Roaring '20s. When you say Roaring '20s, everyone kind of has this picture in their head, right?
Sure.
Boundless prosperity, carefree fun. But the sources paint a more complex picture, a more nuanced picture.
Yeah, there were definitely some shadows lurking there.
So the U.S. did emerge from World War I as this global economic powerhouse.
No doubt about it.
New technologies were boosting productivity like crazy. And all of a sudden, consumer goods that had been out of reach for most people, cars, radios, refrigerators, you name it,
Yeah.
were suddenly available.
It's kind of like the floodgates opened, right?
Yeah,
And I think what's key here is it wasn't just about stuff being available. It was a shift in the whole mindset, like how people thought about what they could have, what they deserved. Credit and installment plans became really widespread, so even if you couldn't afford something outright, you could still buy it.
right.
Put a little down, pay a little each month. And that's when that American standard of living idea really takes root, this belief that a certain level of material comfort wasn't just, a possibility, but almost like a key measure of success in American society.
It's like that keeping up with the Joneses mentality
Yeah.
that, let's be honest, is still around today.
Mm-hmm.
But, like you said, the sources make it clear that this prosperity wasn't exactly equally distributed.
Oh, yeah.
Not even close. In 1929, the top 5% of Americans were earning more than the bottom 60% combined. And get this, a whopping 40% of Americans were living at or below the poverty line.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark contrast, isn't it?
It's huge. So you've got some folks doing the Charleston, and you've got others struggling to put food on the table.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember this disparity didn't just happen by chance, It was rooted in some very real systemic issues.
Right.
Take the farmers, for example. Even with all the advancements in technology, they were facing declining incomes. Why? Because they were producing more than they could sell, driving prices way down.
Makes sense.
And then you had this influx of lower-wage Mexican farm laborers in the West, which added another whole layer of complexity to the picture.
It's striking how those themes that we're still wrestling with today, income inequality, immigration, they were already playing out back then. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about another big force at play during this time. Corporations. Their power was exploding, right?
Yeah, definitely. Corporations were growing rapidly, expanding their influence on the economy and society, and they played this really interesting role, too. A lot of them adopted this strategy known as welfare capitalism.
Okay, welfare capitalism, what's that?
Well, on the surface, it sounds pretty good, right? Companies were offering their employees things like pensions and health insurance, paid time off.
Right, almost like they're taking care of them. But I'm guessing there was maybe a bit more to it than that.
Yeah, there was definitely a strategic element to it. Part of it was about cultivating loyalty, making employees feel valued. But crucially, it was also a way to discourage unionization. It was tied to this movement called the American Plan, which pushed for open shops, workplaces where being a union member wasn't a requirement for employment. Basically, it was a way to undermine the growing power of unions.
So it was about control.
Yeah, you could say that.
Kind of like today when you see companies trying to project this super positive image with their branding.
Right.
But behind the scenes, the reality might be quite different.
Right. Appearances can be deceiving.
But okay, let's move to the cultural side of the Roaring '20s.
No, yeah, the fun part.
It was a period of major social upheaval, right?
Great time.
And this is where those flappers come in. Short skirts, bob hair, dancing to jazz.
Yeah, it was a whole new look.
It was a real rejection of those old-fashioned norms.
Yeah.
Tell me about the flapper. What did she represent?
Well, she became this symbol of the changing role of women in society. It was about embracing modernity, about women asserting their independence and demanding the right to define their own lives. And the spirit of liberation wasn't just in fashion, it was everywhere. Jazz music, speakeasies, Hollywood movies, they were all pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable.
So this cultural revolution was happening at the same time as all those economic and social changes we talked about.
Right alongside
It's
it.
all connected, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You can't understand one without the other. And, this period also saw some significant strides in the fight for women's rights.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the 19th Amendment had been passed just a few years earlier in 1920, giving women the right to vote.
Huge.
But the push for equality didn't stop there.
So what were some of the other big issues that women were fighting for at that time?
Well, legal equality was a major focus. Alice
Mhm.
Paul and the National Women's Party were really pushing for this thing called the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which basically aimed to eliminate any and all legal distinctions based on sex.
Wow.
It was a pretty radical idea for the time, and it faced a ton of opposition, but it just shows how determined women were to achieve full equality under the law.
It's pretty amazing to see how much progress was made during this era,
For sure.
but it's also kind of sobering how many of these same battles are still being fought today.
Oh, yeah.
It's a reminder that social change is a long and often difficult process. But while we had all this cultural and social change happening, the political landscape of the 1920s,
hmm
it was actually taking a step back from the progressive reforms of the early 20th century.
Yeah, kind of a regression almost. There was a lot of political apathy, a sense of disillusionment among the people, and corruption was rampant. I mean, the Teapot Dome scandal with Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall leasing government oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes, it was huge.
Yeah.
Totally shook public trust in the government. And it was the very first time a U.S. cabinet secretary was sentenced to prison for bribery.
It's interesting, right? You've
Yeah.
got this era of economic prosperity, tons of social change, but then also, at least in the eyes of some, a real sense of moral decline.
Right, like a moral decay eating away at the fabric of society.
So how did people react to that?
Well, this perceived decline really fueled a backlash, particularly from religious fundamentalists who felt like their values were under attack. They saw things like Darwinism, the theory of evolution, alcohol consumption, and just that whole freewheeling spirit of the Jazz Age
Right.
as signs that things were going downhill fast.
Yeah, it's a pattern we see throughout history, right?
For sure.
When society starts changing really rapidly,
Mhm.
you almost always get this pushback from people who feel like their way of life is threatened.
Yeah, it's like a defense mechanism almost. And this clash between traditional values and the forces of modernity, it really came to a head with the Scopes trial in 1925.
Oh, the Scopes monkey trial, some people called it.
Right, exactly.
Okay, remind me what that was all about.
So you had this high school teacher in Tennessee, John Scopes, and he was arrested for violating a state law.
Okay.
And that law prohibited the teaching of evolution.
Huh.
So the trial became this national sensation,
That was huge.
pitting the forces of modern science against traditional religious beliefs. And it really became about so much more than just teaching evolution. It was about, the very soul of America, what values would define the nation moving forward.
And of course, it's a debate that continues to this day in different forms.
Yeah, it's never really gone away, has it?
That tension between science and religion, between tradition and progress, it's always there.
Hmm.
But, along with these cultural and ideological battles, there were also some very real, very dangerous expressions of intolerance during this time.
Unfortunately, yeah. We saw this resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, in the 1920s. It was fueled by all these fears about immigration, social change, and the erosion of traditional values. And this time around, their targets weren't just African Americans. They were terrorizing immigrants, Jews, Catholics, feminists, unions, really anyone they saw as a threat to their vision of a white Protestant America.
It's scary to think that such a hateful organization could gain so much power, especially during a time that we think of as being, so progressive in some ways.
Right, but I think it speaks to these anxieties simmering beneath the surface. This was a time of massive change, and for a lot of people, that was really unsettling.
So the KKK, they were exploiting those anxieties, those fears.
Exactly. They were preying on fears of economic insecurity, cultural change, and that loss of traditional power structures.
So it wasn't just limited to these hate groups, right? This fear of the other, as they say.
Yeah.
It was shaping national policy as well.
Oh, absolutely. The National Origins Act of 1924 is a prime example. It severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, reflecting this nativist sentiment that was really taking hold.
So the idea was that these immigrants were somehow less desirable.
Yeah, less capable of assimilating, a threat to the American way of life. All that. It's pretty ironic when you think about it.
Yeah.
Here's America, a nation built by immigrants.
Right.
And now we're saying, nope, we don't want you.
It's a reminder that even in a country founded on the idea of welcoming people from all over, that fear of those who are different, it can be really powerful,
Oh, yeah.
really destructive. But even in the midst of all that fear and intolerance, there were also voices of reason, of compassion, people pushing for a more inclusive America.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the most prominent voices was Franz Boas, a really influential anthropologist. He challenged the whole idea of racial superiority, said there was no scientific basis for it.
So instead of seeing diversity as a threat, he was saying it was a strength.
Exactly. He believed that America's diverse cultural heritage was something to be celebrated, not feared. And this idea, this belief in cultural pluralism, it found its most vibrant expression in the Harlem Renaissance.
Ugh, the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh.
That was something special, right?
It was an incredible time.
Tell me about it.
Okay, picture Harlem, New York City. You've got this explosion of African-American art, music, literature, intellectual thought, everything.
This is during the 1920s, right?
Right in the heart of it.
Wow.
Think Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, Aaron Douglas.
So much talent, so much creativity.
It's amazing to think about all that energy, all that brilliance flourishing during such a turbulent time.
It's a testament to, the resilience of the human spirit.
I think so, yeah. And it's important to remember the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just about artistic expression. It was a movement. It was about challenging racial stereotypes, demanding equality, and forging a new sense of Black identity and pride.
It's incredible how much was happening at this time. So much change, so much conflict, but also so much creativity, so much possibility. But, the Roaring '20s couldn't last forever, and that party came to a screeching halt with the stock market crash of 1929.
Yeah.
And that's when one of the darkest chapters in American history began.
For sure. The Great Depression and a lot of the seeds for that were actually sown during the boom years, Over-speculation in the stock market, risky lending practices, everyone living beyond their means. It created this really fragile economic foundation, so when the bubble burst, the consequences were devastating.
Tell me about that fateful day, Black Tuesday. What actually happened?
Well, on October 29, 1929, the stock market just plummeted. Billions of dollars in value just wiped out, poof, gone. It was a day that really would be etched in American memory forever, a symbol of that sudden and catastrophic end to prosperity.
It must have felt like the world was ending.
I mean, for a lot of people, it did. The crash triggered this chain reaction that rippled through the American economy. Banks were failing left and right, businesses going bankrupt, millions of Americans losing their jobs, their homes, their livelihoods. It was rough.
And this is about more than just numbers on a balance sheet.
Sure.
We're talking about real people trying to survive.
Absolutely. And the statistics from that period are just heartbreaking. A 30% drop in the gross national product, 40% deflation,
Wow.
unemployment soaring to 25%. Think about that. 1 out of every 4 Americans out of work.
Wow. And behind those numbers are stories of just unimaginable hardship.
Yeah, families torn apart, dreams shattered. This was a nation grappling with a crisis unlike any it had ever seen before. And you know what? The Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis.
Right?
It was a social and political crisis. And that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between the American people and their government.
And that is exactly what we are going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
It's crucial to understand just how deep this crisis was as we dive into the response to the Great Depression, not just an economic downturn.
Oh, absolutely. The sources really drive that point home. Like when you see those photographs of Hoovervilles,
Right.
people were barely scraping by.
It really shook the foundations of American society.
So how did President Hoover handle this? I mean, he was in office when the crash happened. It was unprecedented.
Yeah, it was. Initially, Hoover believed in a hands-off approach.
Really?
He thought the economy would just sort of correct itself eventually, like government intervention would actually make things worse.
Okay.
So he appealed to businesses to keep wages stable, encouraged private charity to help those in need, really emphasized individual resilience.
So that classic pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of message.
Yeah, exactly.
But, I mean, things were so dire. Did people really buy into that?
Not really, no. As the crisis just kept getting worse, people got more and more frustrated.
Yeah, I bet.
With Hoover, I mean, they felt like he was out of touch with what everyday Americans were going through,
Like he was living in an ivory tower somewhere.
And some of his policies actually backfired and made things worse.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, there was the Hawley-Smoot tariff.
Okay.
The idea was to protect American businesses, so they raised taxes on imported goods. But it totally backfired. It ended up hindering international trade.
Oh, I see.
And that made the economic downturn even worse.
So the government was actually making things worse in some ways.
Yeah, in some ways,
I bet that really added to the public discontent.
it did. And then Hoover refused to give direct federal aid to the unemployed.
You wouldn't do it.
He thought it would create a culture of dependency, but a lot of Americans are like, we need help now.
They needed a lifeline.
Yeah, they saw it as that.
It's interesting how that whole debate about the role of government, providing a safety net, we're still having that conversation today.
Absolutely. And as the 1932 election rolled around,
Right.
people were desperate for someone who would offer something different, a leader who seemed to get it,
Yeah.
someone willing to take action.
Enter FDR.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah. He promised a new deal for the American people.
Yeah.
Big, sweeping reforms to tackle this crisis head on. What did that new deal actually look like, though?
Well, it was really remarkable for its scope and ambition. It aimed to give relief to people who were suffering from the Depression,
Okay.
get the economy moving again, and then put some reforms in place to make sure something like this never happened again.
So not just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, but actually trying to change the system.
Exactly. And right away, one of the biggest challenges facing FDR was the banking crisis.
Right.
Banks were failing constantly. People were losing their savings. The whole financial system was about to go kaput.
Trial by fire for FDR. So what did he do?
Well, one of the very first things he did as president was declare a bank holiday.
A bank holiday. What's that?
He closed all the banks,
All of them.
all across the country, temporarily.
Wow.
It gave the government some breathing room,
Yeah, bet.
assess the situation, give support to the banks that were in trouble, and try to restore public confidence.
I bet that was a pretty dramatic move, just shutting down all the banks like that.
It was, but people saw it as necessary to avoid a total financial meltdown. And then he followed that up with some serious reforms.
Like what?
Well, like the Emergency Banking Act. It gave the government more control over the banking system.
Okay.
And then there was the Glass-Steagall Act. That one separated commercial and investment banking.
So banks couldn't just gamble with people's money anymore.
Exactly. And that act also created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation,
Okay.
which insured bank deposits up to a certain amount.
It's still around today, right?
Yeah, that sense of security for depositors.
Wow.
It came from that.
Wow. It's fascinating to see how those early actions, during the 100 days, the start of FDR's presidency,
Right.
had such a huge impact.
Yeah, those 100 days showed just how determined FDR was to act fast, act decisively. But it wasn't just about saving the banks. It was about getting people back to work, getting the economy moving again.
Right. So this is where we start to see those iconic images of New Deal programs, people building dams and planting trees and all that.
Exactly. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, they put millions of young guys to work on all these conservation and infrastructure projects.
Right.
Planting trees, building trails, fighting forest fires.
That's a win-win, right?
Yeah.
Jobs and helping the environment.
Exactly. And some of those trees that the CCC planted are still standing today.
Wow, a real legacy.
And then you had these massive public works projects, agencies like the Public Works Administration, the PWA, building roads, schools, hospitals, dams.
It was about rebuilding America.
Yeah, both physically and psychologically, I think. It was about giving people hope, reminding them that even in the face of all this hardship, they could still achieve great things. And the New Deal also did a lot to try and help the farmers.
Right, because they had been struggling for years.
Yeah.
How did the New Deal address that?
Well, they created this thing called the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA.
Okay.
It was meant to raise farm prices by controlling production. So farmers got paid to plant less, to reduce their acreage, and to slaughter some of their livestock.
I can see how that would be controversial.
It was about reducing supply to drive prices up, but at a time when people were going hungry, slaughtering livestock, that was a tough sell for a lot of folks.
Makes sense.
But the AAA did give some relief, at least for a while. And I think it highlights how hard it was to address this kind of multi-layered crisis.
Right?
And to make matters worse, on top of all the economic problems, you had this major natural disaster, the Dust Bowl.
The Dust Bowl. It's hard to even imagine those dust storms, you know.
They were enormous. Years of drought and bad farming practices had stripped the land, so there was nothing to hold the soil down. These massive dust storms swept across the Great Plains, choked the air, buried towns. It was devastating.
It must have felt like the end of the world.
For a lot of people, it probably did. Farmers had to abandon their land. They migrated west looking for a new start. They called them Okies. The Dust Bowl was just this stark reminder of how connected we are to the environment, and what happens when we don't take care of it.
So the New Deal was dealing with a collapsed economy, mass unemployment, a struggling agricultural sector, and a massive natural disaster.
Yeah, an unprecedented task.
It's hard to even imagine trying to tackle all of that.
It really was. And, the New Deal had its successes, it had its failures, but it really changed the relationship between Americans and their government. It made the federal government much more involved in providing a safety net, regulating the economy, and taking care of people.
One of the most important parts of the New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935.
Oh, yeah.
Created unemployment insurance, old age pensions, aid to the disabled, all that.
Social Security was huge, a real turning point in American history.
Yeah.
It established this principle that the government has a responsibility to provide some basic level of economic security, a really radical idea.
Hard to imagine life without it now.
It's so fundamental to our society.
And it's grown and evolved over the decades.
It has. Later generations took what the New Deal started and expanded on it.
So the New Deal wasn't just about fixing the problems of the Great Depression. It was the start of something new.
Yeah, it was about building a different kind of future for America.
And it still shapes our world today.
Definitely.
But even with all the suffering, not everyone was on board with these massive changes, right?
No, not at all. The New Deal was super controversial. A lot of people thought it was way too much government intervention.
Too much government control.
They thought it would stifle individual initiative, hurt free enterprise. And those criticisms came from all sides.
So it wasn't just a simple left versus right kind of thing.
No, some conservatives saw it as this dangerous step towards socialism. And then you had some progressives who thought it didn't go far enough.
It sounds like the New Deal was walking a very fine line.
Yeah, trying to balance all these different interests and ideas about what America should be. And the challenges didn't just come from politicians. The Supreme Court got involved, too.
Really?
Yeah, at the time, it had a conservative majority,
Yep.
and they struck down some big New Deal programs, like the NRA. They said those programs exceeded the government's power under the Constitution.
So they were a roadblock for FDR.
They were. And that led to one of the most controversial things FDR ever did, his attempt to pack the Supreme Court.
Oh, yeah, the court packing plan. What was he thinking?
Well, he was frustrated
Really voice sense.
with the court,
Yeah.
blocking his program, so he proposed this plan to add more justices.
Just add more justices.
Yeah, officially it was to help with the workload,
Because they were getting old.
Right. But everyone saw right through that.
Oh, yeah.
His critics said he was just trying to stack the court with people who agreed with him.
That's pretty bold.
It was, and it totally backfired.
I'll bet.
Congress hated it, and it was defeated. It was a big loss for FDR.
Hurt his reputation.
Definitely. But it's interesting. Some historians think that all the controversy actually had an effect on the court anyway.
Really? How so?
Well, after all that, the court started upholding New Deal legislation.
They backed down.
Maybe they didn't want another fight with FDR.
So maybe he got what he wanted anyway.
Maybe, even if it wasn't how he planned it.
Sometimes things work out that way. It's a reminder that history is messy.
Yeah, full of twists and turns. The New Deal is a perfect example of that. It was a response to a specific time and a specific crisis, but it still affects us today.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore that legacy. See how the New Deal is still relevant to the challenges we face today. So we've covered so much in this deep dive,
Yeah.
the highs of the Roaring '20s, the lows of the Great Depression,
Yeah.
the bold moves of the New Deal.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean?
That's the big question
What's
now.
the lasting legacy?
It's a tough one. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Historians are still debating it, but
The legacy of this whole era is it's incredible.
it's been a pleasure talking about all this with you.
Likewise.
Really digging into these sources. I hope our listener learned a lot from this.
I think so, too. I'm ending this deep dive with a feeling of I don't know, gratitude for the lessons of the past
Mm-hmm.
and hope for the future.
Me too.
The New Deal era shows us that even in dark times, we can create a better world,
Yeah,
and that the choices we make today matter. They really, really matter.
couldn't have said it better myself. So as we go forward, let's remember, the courage, the compassion, and the innovative spirit of the people who lived through the Depression.
Yeah, the people who charted a new course for America.
Their legacy.
Yeah.
It should inspire us all, it tells us. You know what? Even in the face of tough times,
Mm.
we can build a more just world for everyone. Thanks for joining us.